Sometimes the most shocking truths are hidden in the most ordinary places. What if the very ground beneath your feet held secrets that could solve a mystery that had haunted a community for years? What if nature itself became the detective, slowly revealing evidence that human investigators had missed? In the small riverside town of Millbrook, Tennessee, the Cumberland River had been quietly keeping a terrible secret for 3 long years. When the water finally spoke, it would shatter everything the townspeople thought they knew about a night of terror that changed their lives forever. Detective Sarah Martinez had seen her share of strange cases during her 15 years with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, but nothing quite prepared her for the phone call she received on that crisp October morning in 2019. The voice on the other end belonged to Tommy Henricks, a local fisherman whose weathered hands had pulled everything from catfish to old tires from the Cumberland River over the past 4 decades. "Detective, you need to get down here to the river." Tommy's voice trembled slightly through the phone. "I found something that ain't supposed to be here." Sarah grabbed her jacket and headed toward Millbrook, a town of barely 3,000 people nestled along the winding banks of the Cumberland River. As she drove through the familiar streets lined with modest homes and family-owned businesses, she couldn't shake the feeling that this call would be different from the routine investigations that usually brought her to this quiet community. Tommy was waiting for her at the boat launch, his fishing gear scattered on the wooden dock. His usually jovial demeanor had been replaced by a somber expression that immediately put Sarah on alert. Without saying a word, he led her along the riverbank to a spot where the water had carved out a small inlet over the years. Right there, Tommy pointed toward a partially submerged object caught between 2 large rocks. "Been fishing this spot for near 40 years, and I ain't never seen nothing like that." Sarah followed his gaze and felt her pulse quicken. Wedged between the rocks was what appeared to be a rifle, its stock visible above the waterline. The metal barrel had turned a rusty brown color from years of exposure to the elements, but the weapon was unmistakably real. "How long you think it's been there?" Sarah asked, already pulling out her phone to call for backup and the crime scene unit. Tommy scratched his gray beard thoughtfully. "Hard to say for certain, but judging by the rust and the way them rocks have shifted, I'd guess at least a couple years. Maybe more." As Sarah waited for her team to arrive, she studied the surrounding area. The inlet was tucked away from the main flow of the river, partially hidden by overhanging willow trees. It wasn't a spot that casual visitors would stumble upon, but it was accessible to someone who knew the area well. The location suggested that whoever had disposed of the weapon had been familiar with the river and its hidden corners. When the crime scene team arrived, they carefully extracted the rifle from its watery hiding place. Despite years of submersion, the weapon was in remarkably good condition. The serial numbers were still visible, and there were clear signs that it had been fired recently before being discarded. "This is a Remington 700, observed crime scene technician Mike Chun as he examined the rifle. Popular hunting rifle, but also used by military and law enforcement snipers. We should be able to trace the serial number pretty easily." Sarah nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead to the implications of this discovery. 3 years earlier, Millbrook had been shaken by a shooting that had left the community traumatized and the investigation frustratingly incomplete. On the night of September 15th, 2016, someone had opened fire during the annual Harvest Festival, sending hundreds of families scrambling for cover and leaving 2 people wounded. The shooter had vanished without a trace, despite an extensive investigation that had involved local police, state investigators, and even the FBI. No weapon had ever been recovered, no suspect had been identified, and the case had gradually gone cold, leaving the people of Millbrook to wonder if they would ever feel truly safe again. Now, 3 years later, the river had given up what might be the key piece of evidence that could finally solve the case. Back at the lab, the initial tests on the rifle confirmed Sarah's suspicions. Ballistics analysis showed that the weapon had indeed been fired, and traces of gunpowder residue indicated that it had been discharged multiple times before being submerged. More importantly, the caliber and rifling patterns were consistent with the bullets that had been recovered from the Harvest Festival shooting scene. The serial number trace revealed that the rifle had been purchased legally at a sporting goods store in Nashville just 2 months before the shooting. The buyer had provided proper identification and passed all required background checks. But when Sarah attempted to contact him, she discovered that the address and phone number on the paperwork were fake. "Looks like our shooter planned this pretty carefully," Sarah told her partner, Detective Ray Thompson, as they reviewed the evidence. Fake identity, cash purchase, and he knew enough about the river to find a good hiding spot for the weapon. Ray, a 20-year veteran of law enforcement who had worked the original Harvest Festival case, leaned back in his chair and sighed. Question is, why dump the gun in the river instead of just destroying it completely? Seems like a lot of risk to take. It was a good point. Most criminals who wanted to dispose of a weapon would either melt it down, bury it, or throw it into a body of water where it would never be found. The Cumberland River, while deep in some areas, was also heavily traveled by fishermen and recreational boaters. Hiding the rifle in the inlet suggested someone who was familiar with the area, but perhaps not as careful as they should have been. The breakthrough came when the lab managed to extract partial fingerprints from the rifle's scope. Despite years of water damage, advanced forensic techniques revealed enough detail to run the prints through various databases. The results sent a chill through the investigation team. The fingerprints belonged to Marcus Webb, a 34-year-old former Army sniper who had grown up in Millbrook before enlisting after high school. Marcus had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had received commendations for his marksmanship skills, but his military record also showed signs of psychological stress following his combat experiences. Sarah and Ray drove to Marcus's last known address, a small apartment complex on the outskirts of town. The building was run down, with peeling paint and broken windows that spoke to the economic struggles that had affected many rural communities in recent years. When they knocked on the door of apartment 2B, there was no answer. The landlord, a heavy-set man named Carl Briggs, met them in the hallway with a suspicious expression. "You looking for Marcus? He ain't been around for near 3 years now. Just up and disappeared one day, left all his stuff behind. Had to clean out and rent the place to somebody else." "Did he say where he was going?" Sarah asked. Carl shook his head. Marcus wasn't much for talking. Kept to himself mostly. Only time I really saw him was when he'd go out hunting or fishing down by the river. That boy knew them woods and water better than just about anybody. The timeline was starting to make sense. Marcus had disappeared right around the time of the Harvest Festival shooting, and his knowledge of the local area would have made him capable of both executing the attack and hiding the evidence afterward. But Sarah knew they needed more than circumstantial evidence to build a case. A search warrant for Marcus's abandoned belongings, which Carl had stored in the building's basement, revealed additional pieces of the puzzle. Among his personal effects were military medals, photographs from his service in Afghanistan, and several notebooks filled with increasingly erratic handwriting. The entries detailed his struggles with what appeared to be post-traumatic stress disorder, his growing isolation from the community, and his anger toward what he perceived as the town's indifference to veterans' issues. One entry, dated just 2 weeks before the Harvest Festival, was particularly chilling. "They celebrate while we suffer. They feast while we starve. They need to understand what it feels like to be afraid." But perhaps the most significant discovery was a detailed map of the festival grounds, with notations marking potential shooting positions and escape routes. The map confirmed that the attack had been carefully planned, not a spontaneous act of violence. As the investigation deepened, Sarah and her team began to piece together Marcus's movements in the days leading up to the shooting. Security camera footage from local businesses showed him conducting surveillance of the festival site, and witnesses recalled seeing him asking detailed questions about the event schedule and security arrangements. The motive became clearer as they learned more about Marcus's post-military struggles. He had been unable to find steady work since returning from Afghanistan, had been denied disability benefits for his PTSD, and had felt increasingly alienated from the community he had once called home. The Harvest Festival, with its celebration of small-town prosperity and togetherness, had apparently become a symbol of everything he felt excluded from. The shooting itself had been carried out with military precision. Marcus had positioned himself in a wooded area overlooking the festival grounds, using his sniper training to take careful shots that wounded, but didn't kill his targets. Witnesses described the shots as coming from different locations, suggesting that he had moved between pre-planned positions to avoid detection. After the shooting, Marcus had apparently made his way to the river, disposed of the weapon in the inlet that he knew from years of fishing and hunting, and then disappeared from Millbrook entirely. For 3 years, he had remained a ghost, leaving behind only questions and a community struggling to heal from an act of violence that seemed to come from nowhere. The discovery of the rifle changed everything. What had once been an unsolved mystery was now a criminal case with physical evidence, a suspect, and a clear motive. But finding Marcus Webb would prove to be another challenge entirely. A nationwide search revealed that Marcus had been living under assumed names in various cities across the country, working odd jobs, and staying off the grid. His military training had served him well in evading detection, and it became clear that he had been planning his disappearance for some time before the shooting. The investigation expanded beyond Millbrook as federal authorities joined the search for Marcus. His photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country, and tips began to pour in from people who believed they had encountered him in their communities. Meanwhile, the people of Millbrook struggled to process the revelation that their attacker had been one of their own. Marcus Webb wasn't a stranger or an outsider. He was someone who had grown up among them, had served his country with honor, and had somehow fallen through the cracks of a system that was supposed to support veterans returning from combat. The discovery raised uncomfortable questions about how well the community really knew its neighbors, and whether there were other struggling veterans who might be slipping toward violence without anyone noticing. Local churches and community organizations began reaching out to veterans in the area, offering support and resources that perhaps should have been available years earlier. For Tommy Henricks, the fisherman who had discovered the rifle, the revelation was particularly troubling. He had known Marcus since the boy was young, had even taken him fishing a few times when Marcus was a teenager. The thought that someone he had watched grow up had been capable of such violence was difficult to accept. Makes you wonder what we missed, Tommy told Sarah during a follow-up interview. That boy was hurting, and none of us saw it. Maybe if we'd paid more attention, things would have turned out different. As the first phase of the investigation drew to a close, Sarah found herself reflecting on the role that the river had played in finally breaking the case open. The Cumberland had kept Marcus's secret for 3 years, protecting the evidence from the elements and from discovery. But in the end, the river's own processes had shifted the rocks and changed the water levels enough to reveal what had been hidden. It was as if nature itself had decided that the truth needed to come out, that the community deserved answers after years of uncertainty and fear. The river had been a silent witness to Marcus's crime, and when the time was right, it had given up its secret to help bring justice. The investigation was far from over, but the discovery of the rifle had transformed the case from an unsolved mystery into an active manhunt. Somewhere out there, Marcus Webb was still free, still carrying the burden of what he had done on that September night 3 years earlier. The river had revealed the first piece of the puzzle, but many questions remained unanswered. How had Marcus managed to stay hidden for so long? What had driven him from a troubled veteran to an active shooter? And most importantly, where was he now? And what would it take to bring him to justice? The answers to these questions would unfold over the coming months as the investigation intensified and the search for Marcus Webb expanded across the country. But for now, the people of Millbrook had something they hadn't had in 3 years. Hope that their long nightmare might finally be coming to an end. The river had spoken, and its message was clear. The truth, no matter how long it remained hidden, would eventually surface. Justice might be delayed, but it would not be denied. And sometimes, the most important evidence comes from the most unexpected places, revealed by forces beyond human control when the time is right for answers to emerge from the depths of mystery. The morning after the rifle was confirmed to be the weapon used in the Harvest Festival shooting, Detective Sarah Martinez stood in the briefing room of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation field office, looking at a wall covered with photographs, maps, and timeline charts. The investigation had evolved from a cold case into an active federal manhunt, and the pressure to find Marcus Webb was mounting with each passing hour. FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh had joined the task force, bringing with her resources and expertise in tracking fugitives. A tall woman with sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor, Agent Walsh had spent the last decade hunting down suspects who had managed to disappear into America's vast landscape of anonymous cities and forgotten communities. Marcus Webb is smart, trained, and motivated, Walsh told the assembled team of investigators. His military background means he understands surveillance, counter-surveillance, and how to live off the grid. But it also means he has patterns and habits that we can potentially exploit. The team had spent the past week building a comprehensive profile of Marcus Webb, studying everything from his military service records to his social media activity in the months before the shooting. What emerged was a picture of a man who had been steadily deteriorating mentally while becoming increasingly skilled at hiding his struggles from those around him. Dr. Elizabeth Chun, a forensic psychologist brought in to consult on the case, had analyzed Marcus's personal writings and military records. Her assessment painted a troubling portrait of a veteran who had been failed by multiple systems designed to help him transition back to civilian life. Marcus Webb exhibits classic signs of combat-related PTSD, complicated by what appears to be a growing sense of persecution and social isolation, Dr. Chun explained to the task force. His writings suggest that he began to view his community as hostile, seeing the Harvest Festival as a symbol of a society that had abandoned him. The shooting wasn't random violence. It was a calculated act of revenge against what he perceived as an ungrateful community. The psychological profile helped explain the shooting, but it also provided insights into where Marcus might have gone and how he might be living. Dr. Chun suggested that he would be drawn to isolated areas where he could maintain control over his environment, possibly rural communities where he could blend in while staying away from law enforcement. He won't be in major cities, she predicted. Too much surveillance, too many people. He'll seek out places where he can remain anonymous, but still have access to basic resources. Small towns, rural areas, maybe seasonal work that doesn't require extensive background checks. Acting on this profile, the task force began systematically checking reports of transient workers, seasonal employees, and cash-based labor in rural areas across the Southeast. They focused particularly on locations near military installations, reasoning that Marcus might be drawn to areas where his military background would be common and less likely to attract attention. The first significant lead came from a construction foreman in eastern Kentucky who recognized Marcus's photograph from a wanted poster distributed by the FBI. Bill Crawford had hired a man, calling himself Mike Wilson, to work on a bridge repair project 6 months earlier. The man had claimed to be a veteran looking for temporary work, and his skills with tools and equipment had impressed Crawford enough that he hadn't asked too many questions about his background. He was a good worker, kept to himself mostly, Crawford told Agent Walsh during a phone interview. Said he was traveling around, picking up work where he could find it. Paid him in cash like he requested. Never caused any trouble, but there was something about him that seemed off. Like he was always watching, always thinking about something else. Crawford's description matched Marcus Webb perfectly, down to a distinctive scar on his left forearm from a training accident during his Army service. More importantly, Crawford remembered that Mike Wilson had mentioned planning to head south when the bridge project ended, possibly toward the Smoky Mountains area of Tennessee and North Carolina. This information triggered a massive search operation across the mountain region, with local law enforcement agencies providing photographs and descriptions to every business, campground, and boarding house in the area. The rugged terrain of the Smokies would provide perfect hiding places for someone with Marcus's survival skills. But it also meant that any search would be incredibly challenging. While the search continued, the investigation team delved deeper into Marcus's past, looking for patterns that might predict his future behavior. They discovered that his problems had begun long before his military discharge. School records showed that he had been a troubled teenager, struggling with anger management and social isolation even before he enlisted. His military service had initially provided structure and purpose, but his combat experiences in Afghanistan had clearly taken a toll. After-action reports from his unit described increasingly erratic behavior during his second deployment, including incidents of excessive force and conflicts with superior officers who tried to get him psychological help. The military tried to help him, explained Colonel Janet Morrison, who had served as Marcus's commanding officer during his final months of service. We arranged counseling. We adjusted his duties to reduce stress. We even recommended him for early discharge with full benefits. But Marcus refused most of the help we offered. He seemed to view seeking help as a sign of weakness. After his discharge, Marcus had returned to Millbrook with what military doctors had diagnosed as severe PTSD, but he had refused to follow up with treatment. VA records showed multiple missed appointments and a pattern of avoiding the support services that were available to him. His family situation had only complicated matters. Marcus's parents had died in a car accident while he was deployed, and he had no siblings or close relatives in the area. His few attempts at romantic relationships had ended badly, with one ex-girlfriend telling investigators that Marcus had become increasingly paranoid and controlling in the months before she broke up with him. He started saying that people were watching him, that the government was keeping track of veterans who might cause trouble, recalled Jessica Palmer, who had dated Marcus for about 6 months after his return from Afghanistan. At first, I thought it was just adjustment issues, but it got worse and worse. He would sit by the window for hours, watching for cars that drove by too slowly or people who looked at the house too long. This information helped the task force understand how Marcus had been able to plan and execute both the shooting and his subsequent disappearance. His paranoia about surveillance had ironically made him extremely skilled at avoiding detection, while his military training had given him the tools to live independently in challenging conditions. The search in the Smoky Mountains yielded several promising leads, but no concrete sightings of Marcus. Rangers found evidence of recent camping in remote areas, including fire rings and temporary shelters that suggested someone with survival training had been living rough in the wilderness. However, DNA testing of hair and other biological evidence found at these sites came back negative for Marcus Webb. 3 weeks into the mountain search, another lead emerged from an unexpected source. A postal worker in western North Carolina reported that she had been delivering mail to a general delivery box for someone using the name Mark Webster. The man had paid for the service in cash and had specifically requested that mail be held rather than delivered to an address. Agent Walsh immediately recognized the significance of the name. Mark Webster shared the initials MW with Marcus Webb, and the slight variation was exactly the kind of alias that fugitives often chose to help them remember their false identity. It's close enough to his real name that he won't forget it under pressure, but different enough that it won't trigger immediate recognition, Walsh explained to the team. Classic fugitive behavior. The postal worker's description of Mark Webster matched Marcus Webb in height and build, although she noted that the man had grown a full beard and had lost considerable weight since whatever photograph she might have seen on the news. More importantly, she remembered that he had asked specific questions about mail delivery schedules and had seemed very concerned about avoiding contact with other customers. The task force quickly established surveillance on the post office, hoping to catch Marcus when he came to collect his mail. They also began investigating what kind of mail he might be receiving and where it might be coming from. The surveillance operation revealed Marcus's meticulous approach to avoiding detection. Rather than visiting the post office on a regular schedule, he appeared to be watching the building from a distance to determine the best times to approach undetected. Security camera analysis showed a figure matching his description observing the post office from various positions over a period of several days before making brief visits to collect mail. His timing was carefully calculated to avoid peak business hours, law enforcement presence, and periods when he might encounter other customers who could remember him. He never stayed in the building for more than a few minutes, and always approached on foot, suggesting that he was staying somewhere within walking distance. The area around the post office was a small mountain community called Cedar Falls, population barely 800. It was exactly the kind of place that Dr. Chun had predicted Marcus would choose, isolated, close-knit enough that strangers would be noticed, but not so small that one more transient would attract immediate attention. Local law enforcement began a careful canvass of the area, checking with landlords, business owners, and residents to see if anyone had noticed a newcomer matching Marcus's description. They had to balance the need for information with the risk of alerting Marcus that they were closing in on his location. The breakthrough came from an elderly woman named Dorothy Hayes, who owned a small cabin rental business on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. She had been renting a one-room cabin to a man calling himself Mark Webster for the past 2 months, paid in advance with cash. He said he was a writer working on a book about mountain communities. Mrs. Hayes told Deputy Sheriff Tom Bradley during what was supposed to be a routine welfare check. Seemed nice enough, very polite, but he made it clear that he didn't want to be disturbed. Said he needed complete quiet to concentrate on his work. The cabin was located about 3 miles from the post office, accessible by a winding dirt road that wound through dense forest. It was the perfect location for someone who wanted to remain hidden while still having access to basic services. More importantly, it offered multiple escape routes through the surrounding wilderness if Marcus realized he was being watched. Agent Walsh coordinated with local SWAT teams to plan the arrest operation. They knew they would only get one chance to capture Marcus, and his military training meant that he would be both dangerous and resourceful if he realized he was cornered. The arrest plan called for a pre-dawn raid on the cabin, with multiple teams positioned to block all possible escape routes. Thermal imaging equipment would be used to confirm Marcus's presence in the building before the teams moved in, and specialists in hostage negotiation would be standing by in case the situation required de-escalation. But Marcus Webb had not survived 3 years as a fugitive by being careless or predictable. On the night before the planned raid, he simply vanished. Mrs. Hayes discovered the empty cabin the next morning when she went to check on a problem with the water pump. The door was unlocked, the bed was neatly made, and all of Marcus's belongings were gone. The only signs that anyone had been living there were some food scraps in the trash and a few books about local history on the table. It was like he just evaporated, Mrs. Hayes told the frustrated investigators. No car, no noise, nothing. I didn't even know he was gone until I looked inside. The escape was so clean and quiet that it was clear Marcus had been preparing for this possibility from the moment he arrived at the cabin. He had probably been monitoring law enforcement communications, watching for signs that he had been discovered, and maintaining multiple escape plans. A search of the surrounding area revealed that Marcus had been using the local trail system to move around without being detected by road-based surveillance. He had created several cache sites where he had stored supplies and equipment, and he had clearly spent considerable time learning the terrain and planning escape routes. He turned that whole mountain into his personal safe house, observed Agent Walsh as she studied maps of the area. Every trail, every creek, every hiding spot was part of his security plan. By the time we figured out where he was, he already knew we were coming. The failure to capture Marcus at Cedar Falls was disappointing, but it provided valuable intelligence about his methods and capabilities. The task force now knew that they were dealing with someone who was not just hiding, but actively evading capture using sophisticated tactics. Dr. Chin's updated psychological profile suggested that the near miss at Cedar Falls would likely make Marcus even more paranoid and careful about his movements. He would probably avoid establishing any kind of permanent base for some time, instead moving frequently and relying on his survival skills to live in the wilderness. He's been playing defense for 3 years, and it's been working for him, Dr. Chun explained to the task force. The close call at Cedar Falls will reinforce his belief that staying mobile and maintaining multiple escape plans is keeping him safe. But it also means he's under constant stress, always looking over his shoulder, never able to truly relax. This psychological pressure was both an advantage and a disadvantage for the investigators. On one hand, Marcus's stress and paranoia made him more likely to make mistakes or take unnecessary risks. On the other hand, it also made him more dangerous and unpredictable, especially if he began to feel that capture was inevitable. The investigation team regrouped and developed a new strategy based on what they had learned about Marcus's methods and psychology. Instead of trying to track him to a specific location, they would focus on predicting his needs and monitoring the places where he would have to surface for supplies and services. Marcus might be able to live off the land for weeks or even months, but he would eventually need medical care, communication services, or specialized equipment that could only be obtained from civilization. When he did surface, the task force would be ready. The hunt for Marcus Webb was far from over. If anything, the near miss at Cedar Falls had shown just how formidable an opponent they were facing. But it had also revealed his patterns and limitations, providing the investigators with new tools for tracking him down. Somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, Marcus Webb was still free, still dangerous, and still carrying the secrets of what had driven him to violence on that September night 3 years earlier. The river had given up his weapon, but the man himself remained elusive, a ghost moving through the shadows of America's forgotten places. The task force settled in for what they knew would be a long and difficult hunt. Marcus Webb was not just hiding from justice. He was fighting for his freedom and his life. And men with nothing left to lose could be the most dangerous opponents of all. Winter was settling over the Appalachian Mountains when the task force received an unexpected breakthrough in their hunt for Marcus Webb. It came not from sophisticated surveillance or criminal intelligence, but from a concerned emergency room nurse in a small hospital in rural Virginia. Linda Rodriguez had been working the night shift at Buchanan General Hospital when a man walked into the emergency room complaining of severe abdominal pain. Something about him immediately caught her attention. He paid in cash, refused to provide a social security number for insurance purposes, and seemed nervous about the standard intake questions that asked for personal information. He said his name was Mike Willis, but he hesitated before answering, like he had to think about it. Linda later told FBI agent Jennifer Walsh. And when I asked for his address, he gave me the name of a motel that I knew had been closed for months. Little things like that made me suspicious. What really raised Linda's suspicions was the man's behavior during the medical examination. He was clearly in pain, but he kept checking the windows and doorways as if he expected someone to burst in at any moment. When the doctor mentioned that his symptoms might require overnight observation, the man became agitated and insisted on leaving as soon as he received pain medication. Linda had seen enough fugitives and wanted criminals come through the emergency room over her 20 years of nursing to recognize the signs. After the man left, she called the local sheriff's office and filed a report. The description she provided matched Marcus Webb in every significant detail. Agent Walsh arrived at Buchanan General the next morning and reviewed the security camera footage from the emergency room. The man on the video was definitely Marcus Webb, although he had lost considerable weight and his hair had gone almost completely gray in the 3 years since the Harvest Festival shooting. More importantly, the medical records showed that Marcus was suffering from what appeared to be a serious kidney stone condition, a painful ailment that would require ongoing medical care and potentially emergency treatment. Dr. Patricia Vaughn, who had treated him in the emergency room, explained that kidney stones of the size Marcus appear to have would likely cause recurring episodes of severe pain. This isn't something you can just tough out in the wilderness, Dr. Vaughn told the task force. He's going to need medical attention, probably sooner rather than later. The pain is excruciating, and without proper treatment, he could develop serious complications. This medical intelligence gave the task force a crucial advantage. Marcus could hide in the mountains indefinitely, but he couldn't hide from his own body. They began monitoring emergency rooms, urgent care clinics, and medical facilities across a 3-state area, preparing detailed bulletins with Marcus's photograph and medical profile. Dr. Elizabeth Chun updated her psychological assessment based on this new information. The chronic pain and medical stress would be taking a serious toll on Marcus's mental state, potentially making him more desperate and unpredictable. Chronic pain changes people, Dr. Chun explained to the investigative team. It affects judgment, increases paranoia, and can lead to increasingly poor decision-making. Marcus is under tremendous psychological pressure already, and now he's dealing with physical pain that he can't control or treat effectively. This combination makes him more dangerous, but also more likely to make mistakes. The task force implemented a new strategy based on Marcus's medical vulnerabilities. Rather than trying to track him through the wilderness, they would create a network of medical facilities prepared to identify and detain him if he sought treatment. They also began investigating sources of prescription pain medication that Marcus might try to access illegally. The first indication that this strategy was working came from a pharmacy in West Virginia, where the owner reported a break-in that had targeted only the pain medication section of the drug inventory. The perpetrator had clearly known exactly what he was looking for and had taken only opioid painkillers and antibiotics, leaving behind more valuable drugs that would have had a higher street value. Whoever did this knew pharmaceuticals, pharmacist Robert Kim told local investigators. They went straight for the medications that would treat kidney stones and related complications. This wasn't a random drug theft. It was someone with specific medical knowledge looking for specific drugs. The pharmacy security cameras had malfunctioned during the break-in, but witnesses reported seeing a man matching Marcus's description in the area earlier that day. He had been asking casual questions about local hiking trails and camping areas, suggesting that he was still living outdoors despite his medical problems. 2 weeks later, another medical emergency brought Marcus back into the open. This time, it was a veterinary clinic in eastern Tennessee that reported a suspicious incident. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a veterinarian who ran a small animal clinic near the town of Mountain View, had arrived at work to find that someone had broken into her facility and taken antibiotics and surgical supplies. It was strange because they didn't take anything valuable, Dr. Mitchell reported. They left behind controlled substances that would have been worth thousands on the street, but they took basic medical supplies and antibiotics that you might need to treat an infection. The task force realized that Marcus's medical condition was worsening. Kidney stones could lead to urinary tract infections and other complications that would require antibiotic treatment. His desperation for medical supplies suggested that he was trying to treat himself rather than risk another visit to a medical facility where he might be recognized. Agent Walsh coordinated with local law enforcement to increase patrols in the area around Mountain View. They also set up surveillance on other veterinary clinics and medical supply companies, reasoning that Marcus might need to obtain additional supplies as his condition deteriorated. The surveillance paid off 3 days later when security cameras at a medical supply warehouse captured footage of a man matching Marcus's description breaking into the facility. This time, the cameras were working, and the footage clearly showed Marcus Webb's face as he loaded supplies into a backpack. More importantly, the timestamp on the footage was less than 6 hours old when it was discovered, meaning that Marcus was still in the immediate area. The task force mobilized every available unit for the largest manhunt operation since the investigation began. The warehouse was located in a small industrial area about 10 miles from Mountain View. It was surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides, providing multiple escape routes for someone on foot. Agent Walsh positioned teams to block the main roads while search dogs and helicopters scoured the wooded areas where Marcus might be hiding. The search was complicated by the rugged terrain and dense vegetation, but the dogs quickly picked up a scent trail leading away from the warehouse. Marcus had apparently headed straight into the deepest part of the forest, where thick canopy would provide cover from aerial surveillance. For 3 days, the search teams methodically worked their way through miles of wilderness, finding occasional signs of Marcus's passage, but never quite catching up to him. They discovered campsites where he had spent recent nights, still warm ashes from cooking fires, and even a makeshift medical kit where he had apparently been treating his kidney stone symptoms. "He's staying just ahead of us," observed search team leader Captain Mike Rodriguez. "He knows we're coming, and he's using every trick he learned in the military to stay one step ahead. But he's also clearly suffering, and that's going to slow him down eventually." The breakthrough came when one of the search teams discovered a cave system that Marcus had been using as a temporary shelter. The cave was well hidden and would have been almost impossible to find without the search dogs, but it showed clear signs of recent habitation. Inside the cave, investigators found a treasure trove of evidence about how Marcus had been living for the past 3 years. He had created detailed maps of the entire region, marking water sources, food supplies, medical facilities, and law enforcement locations. There were notebooks filled with observations about local residents, business schedules, and security routines. Most disturbing were the weapons and ammunition that Marcus had stockpiled in the cave. In addition to several hunting rifles and handguns, there were military-style explosives and what appeared to be improvised explosive devices. It was clear that Marcus had been preparing for the possibility of a final confrontation with law enforcement. Agent Walsh studied the evidence with growing concern. "He's not planning to be taken alive," she told the task force. "All of this preparation, the weapons, the explosives, this is someone getting ready for a last stand. We need to be prepared for the possibility that he'll try to take people with him when we corner him." Dr. Chen's analysis of Marcus's notebooks supported this assessment. His writings showed a steady deterioration in his mental state, with increasing paranoia and violent fantasies. Recent entries described elaborate plans for attacking law enforcement officers and making them pay for hunting him like an animal. "He's moved beyond simple survival mode," Dr. Chen explained. "The constant stress, the physical pain, and the isolation have pushed him to a point where he may see violence as his only remaining option. He's no longer just running from capture. He's actively planning to fight back." The discovery of Marcus's cave hideout triggered a massive escalation in the search operation. ATF explosive specialists were brought in to analyze the improvised devices, while FBI behavioral analysts worked to predict where Marcus might go next and what he might do. The search teams knew they were dealing with someone who was desperate, well-armed, and prepared to kill. Every step forward had to be carefully planned to minimize the risk of casualties while maintaining pressure on Marcus to prevent him from escaping the area. The terrain worked both for and against the searchers. The dense forest and rugged mountains provided Marcus with places to hide, but they also limited his mobility and forced him to follow predictable routes between water sources and shelter areas. Helicopter thermal imaging began to detect heat signatures in areas where Marcus might be hiding, even though the thick tree cover made visual confirmation impossible. On the 4th day of the search, a National Guard helicopter spotted a heat signature in a remote canyon about 5 miles from the cave system. The location was surrounded by steep cliffs that would make escape difficult, but it also provided Marcus with an excellent defensive position if he chose to fight. Ground teams began moving toward the canyon, while helicopters maintained surveillance from a safe distance. Marcus had apparently chosen his position well. The canyon had only one entrance that could be approached on foot, and the high walls would provide protection from aerial assault while limiting the number of attackers who could approach simultaneously. As the search teams moved closer to the canyon, they began finding signs that Marcus had been preparing the area as a defensive position. Trees had been cut down to create firing lanes, and there were indications that he had set up booby traps along the approach routes. "This is it," Agent Walsh radioed to the command post. "He's not running anymore. He's picked a spot, and he's going to make a stand here. We need to be ready for anything." The task force established a perimeter around the canyon, while negotiators attempted to make contact with Marcus using loudspeakers and cell phone signals. They offered medical treatment for his condition and promised safe passage if he surrendered peacefully. There was no response from the canyon, but Thermal imaging continued to show a heat signature in a protected area among the rocks. Marcus was there, waiting, probably watching the approaches and preparing for what he must have known would be his final confrontation. As night fell, the search teams settled in for what could be a lengthy siege. Marcus had chosen his position well, and rushing the canyon would likely result in casualties. But time was not necessarily on their side. Marcus's medical condition meant that he might become increasingly desperate and unpredictable as his pain worsened. The standoff had begun, and everyone involved knew that it would end one of two ways: with Marcus Webb's surrender or with violence that could cost multiple lives. The River had given up his weapon 3 months earlier, starting a chain of events that had led to this moment in a remote canyon where a desperate man waited for what he probably knew would be his final battle. The hunt that had begun with a fisherman's discovery was approaching its climax, but the most dangerous part was still to come. Marcus Webb was cornered, armed, and prepared to die rather than face capture. The task force would need all their training and experience to bring this manhunt to an end without adding more victims to the tragedy that had begun on a September night 3 years earlier in the town of Millbrook. Dawn broke cold and gray over the canyon where Marcus Webb had made his final stand. FBI agent Jennifer Walsh stood at the command post, studying thermal imaging displays that showed the heat signature hadn't moved in over 12 hours. Marcus was still there, waiting in his rocky fortress, but the lack of movement was becoming increasingly concerning. Dr. Patricia Vaughn, the emergency room physician who had treated Marcus at Buchanan General Hospital, had joined the task force to provide medical consultation. Her assessment of his condition was grim. Based on his symptoms when I examined him, he's probably experiencing severe renal colic by now, Dr. Vaughn explained to the tactical team leaders. The pain would be excruciating, possibly disorienting. He may not be thinking clearly, which makes him even more unpredictable and dangerous. Negotiator Detective Ray Thompson had been trying to establish communication with Marcus for hours, using loudspeakers to call out offers of medical treatment and safe surrender. The canyon walls created strange echoes that made it difficult to determine if Marcus could even hear them clearly, but there had been no response of any kind from the rocky defensive position. Marcus, this is Detective Thompson. Ray's voice echoed through the canyon once again. We know you're hurt, and want to help you. We have medical personnel standing by. All you need to do is come out with your hands visible, and we'll get you the medical care you need. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind whistling through the canyon, and the distant sound of helicopters maintaining their surveillance perimeter. Agent Walsh was beginning to wonder if Marcus was still conscious, or if his medical condition had worsened to the point where he was unable to respond. The tactical team had spent the night analyzing every possible approach to Marcus's position. The canyon geography made it nearly impossible to assault without exposing officers to fire from the elevated defensive position Marcus had chosen. Steep rock walls on 3 sides channeled any approach into a narrow killing zone where Marcus could use his sniper training to devastating effect. Captain Rodriguez, the tactical team leader, had concluded that any direct assault would likely result in multiple casualties. He's at the high ground, clear fields of fire, and prepared positions, Rodriguez briefed the command team. From a military standpoint, it's a perfect defensive position. He could hold off a much larger force for a considerable time. Dr. Elizabeth Chun had been analyzing Marcus's psychological state based on his recent actions and the evidence found in his cave hideout. Her assessment suggested that Marcus had already accepted that he would not survive this confrontation. He's moved into what we call the warrior mindset, Dr. Chun explained. He's not thinking about escape or survival anymore. He's focused entirely on how he wants this to end. And based on his writings, he wants to go out fighting rather than be taken alive. This psychological profile influenced every decision the task force made about how to handle the standoff. Traditional negotiation techniques that relied on convincing a suspect that they had something to live for were unlikely to work with someone who had already decided to die. As the morning wore on, The thermal imaging detected what appeared to be movement in Marcus's position. It was slight and intermittent, suggesting that he was still alive, but possibly weakened by pain and exposure. The overnight temperature had dropped below freezing, and even with shelter among the rocks, hypothermia was becoming a serious concern. "We're running out of time, DR," Vaughn warned the command team. "If he's going into shock from kidney stone complications, combined with hypothermia and dehydration, his window for medical intervention is closing rapidly. Even if we get to him in the next few hours, he may not survive." This medical urgency forced Agent Walsh to make a difficult decision. They could continue the standoff and hope that Marcus would eventually surrender, but his medical condition might kill him before that happened. Alternatively, they could attempt an assault that would likely result in casualties, but might save Marcus's life. The decision was made for them when a sniper rifle shot rang out from the canyon, the sound echoing off the walls with deafening intensity. For a moment, everyone at the command post thought that Marcus had fired at the tactical teams, but a quick check revealed that all officers were accounted for, and none had been targeted. Single shot fired from the suspect's position, reported the spotter team that was monitoring the canyon through high-powered scopes. No apparent target. Possible warning shot or accidental discharge. Agent Walsh grabbed the radio microphone and called out to Marcus directly. "Marcus, this is Agent Walsh with the FBI. We heard the gunshot. Are you injured? Do you need immediate medical assistance?" For the first time in the standoff, there was a response from the canyon. Marcus's voice, weakened but clear, called back across the distance. "I'm done running," he shouted. 3 years I've been running, and I'm tired of it. I'm tired of the pain. I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of everything." Detective Thompson quickly took over the negotiation, recognizing this as the first real opportunity to establish meaningful communication with Marcus. "Marcus, I hear you. I can only imagine how exhausted you must be. But this doesn't have to end badly. We can help you if you'll let us. You need medical care, and we have doctors standing by." There was a long pause before Marcus responded again, his voice carrying across the canyon with an odd echo that made him sound like a ghost speaking from another world. "You don't understand," Marcus called back. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. The festival, the shooting, the running. I just wanted them to understand what it felt like to be afraid." "I know," Ray responded, trying to keep his voice calm and supportive. "We've read your writings, Marcus. We know about your service, about what you went through. We know the system failed you, and we know you were in pain long before any of this started." For the next hour, Ray engaged Marcus in the most extensive conversation anyone had managed since he disappeared 3 years earlier. Slowly, piece by piece, Marcus began to tell his story from his own perspective. He described the isolation and pain of returning from Afghanistan to a community that seemed to have moved on without him. He talked about the nightmares and flashbacks that made it impossible to sleep, the constant hypervigilance that turned every social interaction into a potential threat assessment. I would sit in my apartment and listen to them getting ready for the festival. Marcus's voice drifted across the canyon. Laughing, planning, celebrating. And I realized they had no idea what was happening to people like me. No idea what it cost to give them that safe little world they lived in. Dr. Chun, listening to the conversation through headphones, provided real-time analysis to the negotiation team. "He's cycling between guilt and justification," she whispered to Ray. "The guilt is important. That's what we can work with. He knows what he did was wrong, but he's trapped in a narrative that justifies it." Ray picked up on this insight and began steering the conversation toward Marcus's sense of responsibility for the shooting victims. "Marcus, I know you never intended to kill anyone at the festival. The people who were wounded have recovered. They understand that you were hurting too." There was a long silence from the canyon before Marcus responded, and when he did, his voice was barely audible. "Are they okay? The people I shot? I've wondered about them every day for 3 years." "They're okay," Ray confirmed. "Sarah Mitchell, the teacher who was wounded in the arm, she's back to work. Tom Bradley, the teenager who was hit in the leg, he graduated high school, and He's in college now studying to be a counselor for veterans. This information seemed to affect Marcus profoundly. For several minutes, there was only silence from the canyon, and the thermal imaging showed that the heat signature was moving slightly, suggesting that Marcus was pacing or possibly experiencing some kind of emotional breakdown. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was different, less defiant, and more broken. "I don't know how to come back from this," he said. "I don't know how to face what I've done or how to live with it." Ray recognized this as a crucial moment in the negotiation. Marcus was finally expressing doubt about his chosen path and opening the door to alternative outcomes. "Marcus, the first step is getting you medical care. You're in serious pain, and we can help with that immediately. Everything else we can work through one step at a time." "What's going to happen to me?" Marcus asked. "If I come out, what happens next?" Agent Walsh had anticipated this question and had already discussed the possibilities with the district attorney's office. She signaled to Ray to provide an honest assessment. "You'll be arrested and charged," Ray admitted. "There's no way around that. But you'll also get medical care, psychological counseling, and legal representation. This doesn't have to be the end of your story, Marcus. It can be the beginning of getting your life back." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes as Marcus asked specific questions about the legal process, medical treatment, and what would happen to him in custody. Dr. Chin noted that his questions suggested he was seriously considering surrender rather than the violent confrontation everyone had expected. Finally, Marcus asked the question that everyone had been waiting for. "If I come out, how do I do it? How do I make sure nobody gets hurt?" Ray quickly outlined the surrender procedure that the tactical team had prepared. Marcus would need to emerge from his position with his hands clearly visible, move slowly toward the designated area, and follow specific instructions from the officers. "Marcus, I want you to understand something," Ray added. "There are a lot of armed officers here, and everyone is on edge. It's crucial that you follow the instructions exactly and don't make any sudden movements. We want to get you medical help, but we need to do this safely for everyone involved." There was another long pause before Marcus responded. "I understand. Give me a few minutes to get ready." The next 20 minutes were among the most tense of the entire manhunt. The tactical teams positioned themselves to provide security while maintaining clear sight lines to Marcus's location. Medical personnel moved closer to the canyon entrance, ready to provide immediate treatment. Everyone knew that this was the moment when the situation could either resolve peacefully or explode into violence. Finally, a figure appeared among the rocks of Marcus's defensive position. It was clearly Marcus Webb, although he was barely recognizable after 3 years of living rough and weeks of serious illness. He was painfully thin, his clothes were torn and dirty, and he moved slowly and carefully as he made his way down from the rocks. His hands were raised high above his head, and he called out repeatedly that he was unarmed and surrendering. As he reached the bottom of the canyon, tactical officers moved in to secure him, while medical personnel stood ready to provide immediate treatment. Marcus collapsed as soon as the officers reached him, overcome by pain, exhaustion, and the emotional toll of finally ending his 3-year flight from justice. Dr. Vaughn immediately began medical assessment, while Agent Walsh formally placed him under arrest. "Marcus Webb, you are under arrest for attempted murder, aggravated assault, and federal charges related to the unlawful possession of firearms and explosives," Agent Walsh read from the warrant as medical personnel worked to stabilize his condition. As Marcus was loaded into an ambulance for transport to the hospital, he looked up at Agent Walsh with eyes that seemed both relieved and terrified. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry for all of it." The manhunt that had begun with Tommy Henricks discovering a rifle in the Cumberland River was finally over. Marcus Webb was in custody, alive, and about to face justice for the shooting that had terrorized Millbrook 3 years earlier. But his capture was just the beginning of a new chapter in a story that had already claimed too many casualties and left too many scars. The river had kept Marcus's secret for 3 years, but now all secrets were in the open. The truth about that September night was finally emerging from the depths where it had been hidden, carried to the surface by forces that no one could control or predict. Justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied. As the ambulance carrying Marcus Webb made its way down the mountain toward the hospital, the investigators began the long process of documenting evidence and preparing for the legal proceedings that would follow. But for now, the immediate crisis was over, and a dangerous fugitive was safely in custody. The canyon that had nearly become Marcus's tomb would return to its natural silence, but it would forever be remembered as the place where a desperate man finally chose surrender over self-destruction, where a 3-year game of hide and seek finally came to an end, and where the river's revelation of truth reached its final conclusion in the mountains of Appalachia. 6 months after Marcus Webb's surrender in the Appalachian Canyon, the courthouse in Nashville was packed with reporters, investigators, victims, and residents of Millbrook who had traveled to witness the culmination of a case that had haunted their community for nearly 4 years. The trial of Marcus Webb was about to begin, and with it would come the final answers to questions that had remained hidden beneath the waters of the Cumberland River. Marcus sat at the defense table, barely recognizable as the troubled veteran who had disappeared after the Harvest Festival shooting. Medical treatment had restored his physical health, and months of counseling had helped stabilize his mental condition, but the weight of his actions was evident in every line of his face. His defense attorney, Rebecca Martinez, a specialist in military veteran cases, had spent countless hours preparing a defense that would acknowledge Marcus's guilt while seeking to explain the circumstances that had led to his breakdown. It was a delicate balance between accepting responsibility and helping the court understand the complex factors that had contributed to his actions. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Chun, faced the challenge of seeking justice for the victims while recognizing that Marcus Webb was himself a casualty of a system that had failed to provide adequate support for veterans dealing with combat trauma. The case had attracted national attention as an example of the broader issues facing military veterans returning from overseas deployments. Judge Patricia Reynolds, a veteran of the federal bench who had presided over numerous high-profile cases, called the court to order and addressed the packed courtroom. This case involves serious crimes that caused real harm to innocent people, Judge Reynolds began. But it also raises important questions about our obligations to those who serve our country. We will examine all the evidence, hear all the testimony, and ensure that justice is served while treating all parties with the dignity they deserve. The first phase of the trial focused on establishing the facts of the case. Detective Sarah Martinez took the stand to describe the discovery of the rifle in the Cumberland River and the subsequent investigation that had led to Marcus's identification and capture. She testified about the meticulous planning that Marcus had done before the shooting and the sophisticated methods he had used to evade capture for 3 years. The defendant demonstrated extensive knowledge of both military tactics and local terrain, Detective Martinez testified. His ability to remain hidden for so long while living off the grid showed careful planning and considerable survival skills. Agent Jennifer Walsh followed with testimony about the manhunt and Marcus's eventual surrender. She emphasized that despite being armed and in a defensive position, Marcus had ultimately chosen to surrender rather than engage in a firefight that could have resulted in casualties on both sides. In my 20 years of law enforcement, I've seen many suspects choose violence over surrender when cornered, Agent Walsh told the court. Mr. Webb's decision to give up peacefully, despite being heavily armed and in a strong defensive position, suggests that he retained some sense of moral responsibility even in his darkest moment. The most emotionally charged testimony came from the victims of the shooting. Sarah Mitchell, the teacher who had been wounded in the arm, spoke about the physical and psychological trauma she had endured in the years since the attack. I still can't attend large outdoor events without feeling panic, she testified, her voice steady but strained. Every unexpected noise makes me jump. The physical wound healed, but the emotional scars are still there. However, Sarah's testimony took an unexpected turn when she addressed Marcus directly. I want you to know that I understand you were suffering too, she said, looking across the courtroom at Marcus. I don't excuse what you did, but I've learned about PTSD and the struggles that veterans face. I hope that someday you can find peace and use your experience to help others avoid the path you took. Thomas Bradley, the teenager who had been shot in the leg, had indeed become a counselor specializing in veteran services, as Detective Thompson had told Marcus during the surrender negotiations. His testimony focused on how the shooting had actually inspired his career choice. Being wounded by someone who was himself wounded by war made me realize how many people are hurting in ways we can't see, Thomas testified. I decided to dedicate my career to helping veterans get the support they need before they reach the breaking point. The defense phase of the trial focused heavily on Marcus's military service and the events that had led to his breakdown. Colonel Janet Morrison, his former commanding officer, testified about Marcus's exemplary service record and the obvious signs of psychological trauma that had developed during his combat deployments. Sergeant Webb was one of our most capable soldiers, Colonel Morrison testified. But the toll of combat operations, especially the loss of close friends in his unit, was clearly affecting his mental state. We try to provide support, but the stigma associated with seeking mental health treatment in the military often prevents soldiers from getting the help they need. Dr. Robert Patterson, a psychiatrist who had extensively evaluated Marcus after his capture, provided detailed testimony about his mental state at the time of the shooting and his condition during the years he spent as a fugitive. Mr. Webb was suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, complicated by what we call moral injury, the psychological damage that occurs when someone is forced to act in ways that conflict with their fundamental moral beliefs, Dr. Patterson explained to the jury. His sense of betrayal by a system he had served faithfully, combined with his isolation and lack of support, created a perfect storm of psychological factors that led to his breakdown. The doctor's testimony was particularly powerful when he described how Marcus's condition had evolved during his 3 years as a fugitive. Living constantly on the run, always looking over his shoulder, never able to form meaningful relationships or establish stability. These conditions would have worsened his PTSD symptoms significantly. By the time of his capture, Mr. Webb was experiencing severe paranoia, chronic insomnia, and physical symptoms that were literally killing him. Perhaps the most surprising testimony came from residents of Millbrook who had known Marcus before his deployment. Several people took the stand to describe the young man. They remembered quiet, hardworking, and dedicated to serving his country. Dorothy Hayes, the elderly woman who had unknowingly rented him the cabin during his final months as a fugitive, provided testimony that humanized Marcus in ways that pure legal proceedings could not. He was always polite, always respectful, she testified. He helped me fix my water pump and never asked for anything in return. I could see that he was troubled, but I never imagined the pain he was carrying. If I had known, maybe I could have helped him find a different path. The prosecution's rebuttal focused on the premeditated nature of Marcus's actions and the terror he had inflicted on innocent people. District Attorney Chen argued that while Marcus's military service and PTSD were mitigating factors, they could not excuse the deliberate planning and execution of a violent attack on civilians. The defendant's suffering does not justify causing suffering to others, DA Chen told the jury. We can feel compassion for his struggles while still holding him accountable for his choices. The victims and their families deserve justice, and the community deserves protection from future violence. The closing arguments revealed the complex nature of the case and the difficulty of balancing justice with compassion. The prosecution sought a lengthy prison sentence that would reflect the seriousness of Marcus's crimes, while the defense argued for a sentence that emphasized rehabilitation and mental health treatment. Marcus himself addressed the court before sentencing, speaking publicly for the first time about his actions and their consequences. I want to start by apologizing to everyone I hurt, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. To the people I shot, to their families, to the community of Millbrook that I terrorized. There is no excuse for what I did, and I don't expect forgiveness." He paused, struggling with emotion, before continuing. "I was drowning in pain and anger, and I let that pain turn me into someone I never thought I could become. I lost sight of the values I had sworn to defend and the people I had promised to protect. I became the very thing I had fought against overseas." Marcus looked directly at the victims' families as he spoke his final words. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to spend whatever time I have left trying to make amends. If my story can help even one veteran get help before they reach the breaking point, then maybe some good can come from this tragedy." Judge Reynolds took 2 weeks to consider the evidence before announcing her sentence. When court reconvened, the courtroom was once again packed with people whose lives had been touched by the case. This court has rarely seen a case that so clearly illustrates the complex intersection of military service, mental health, and criminal responsibility. Judge Reynolds began. Mr. Webb's actions caused real harm to innocent people and terrorized an entire community. These crimes demand accountability and consequences. She paused before continuing with the most important part of her ruling. However, this court also recognizes that Mr. Webb is himself a casualty of war and a system that failed to provide adequate support for his service-related injuries. The sentence must reflect both the need for justice and the possibility of redemption. Judge Reynolds sentenced Marcus to 15 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years if he successfully completed mental health treatment and demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. The sentence was lower than the prosecution had requested, but longer than the defense had hoped for. More importantly, Judge Reynolds ordered that Marcus serve his sentence in a federal facility with specialized programs for veterans dealing with PTSD and other service-related conditions. She also mandated that he participate in victim offender mediation programs and speak to veteran groups about his experiences as part of his rehabilitation. "Mr. Webb, you have the opportunity to transform this tragedy into something that might prevent future tragedies," Judge Reynolds told him. "I hope you will use your time in custody to heal not only yourself, but to help others who might be walking the same dangerous path you once traveled." The sentencing brought a measure of closure to the case, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter for everyone involved. The victims would continue their own healing journeys. The community of Millbrook would work to rebuild trust and security, and Marcus Webb would begin the long process of trying to make amends for his actions. 6 months after the trial ended, an unexpected development occurred that would provide the final chapter to the story. The Cumberland River, which had kept Marcus's secret for 3 years before revealing it to Tommy Henricks, yielded one more piece of evidence. During a routine environmental cleanup, workers discovered a waterproof container that Marcus had apparently hidden in the riverbank before the shooting. Inside was a detailed journal that documented his mental decline in the months leading up to the attack, including several entries where he had questioned whether he was planning something terrible and wondered if there was another way to deal with his pain. The journal also contained letters that Marcus had written, but never sent to his dead parents, to his former Army buddies, and to the people of Millbrook. In these letters, he had tried to explain his feelings and his growing desperation, revealing a man who was crying out for help even as he planned an act of violence. Most significantly, the journal contained a detailed plan for the shooting that included specific instructions to himself to avoid killing anyone. Marcus had deliberately planned to wound rather than kill, confirming what the evidence had already suggested about his intentions during the attack. Dr. Elizabeth Chun, who analyzed the journal as part of ongoing research into veteran suicide and violence prevention, found it to be one of the most complete psychological documents she had ever encountered from someone in Marcus's situation. This journal shows clearly that Mr. Webb was struggling desperately to find alternatives to violence, even while planning the attack. Dr. Chun explained to a conference on veteran mental health. It demonstrates how complex these situations are and how many opportunities there might be to intervene if we know what signs to look for. The journal was eventually donated to the National Center for PTSD, where it became part of a research database designed to help mental health professionals better understand and treat veterans at risk for violence. Marcus had agreed to this use of his personal writings as part of his commitment to helping prevent similar tragedies. Tommy Henricks, the fisherman whose discovery had started the whole chain of events, often reflected on the role that the Cumberland River had played in finally bringing the truth to light. He continued to fish the same waters where he had found Marcus's rifle, but the discovery had changed his relationship with the river. That old river has seen a lot of history, Tommy would tell anyone who would listen. Wars, floods, good times, and bad times. But I never thought it would make me part of solving crime. Makes you wonder what other secrets are hiding down there in the mud. For the people of Millbrook, the resolution of the case brought both relief and sadness. Relief that the mystery was finally solved and that the shooter was in custody, but sadness for all the ways that the tragedy could have been prevented if systems and people had worked better. The town established a veteran support center in Marcus's old neighborhood, staffed by counselors trained in military trauma and funded by donations from across the country. The center was named for the victims of the shooting, but was dedicated to preventing future tragedies through early intervention and support. Sarah Mitchell, the wounded teacher, became a volunteer at the center, using her own experience to help other victims of violence while also supporting veterans struggling with readjustment issues. Her work brought her full circle from victim to advocate, transforming her trauma into a force for healing in her community. Thomas Bradley completed his degree in counseling and returned to Millbrook to work at the Veterans Center. His personal experience with both trauma and recovery made him uniquely effective at connecting with veterans who were struggling with similar issues. Marcus Webb served his sentence quietly, participating in every available treatment program and speaking regularly to veteran groups about his experiences. His presentations were powerful reminders of how quickly a life could derail and how important it was for veterans to seek help before reaching a crisis point. After serving 10 years, Marcus was granted parole under strict supervision that included continued mental health treatment and community service. He chose to remain in Tennessee, working with the same veteran center that had been established in Millbrook, using his story to help others avoid the path he had taken. The case became a landmark in the intersection of military service, mental health, and criminal justice. It was studied in law schools and police academies as an example of how complex factors could contribute to violent crime and how the justice system could balance accountability with rehabilitation. But perhaps most importantly, it served as a reminder of the human cost of war and the ongoing responsibilities that society has to those who serve in its defense. Marcus Webb's journey from decorated soldier to fugitive to convicted felon to reformed advocate illustrated both the worst and best possibilities of human nature. The Cumberland River continued to flow past Millbrook, carrying with it the memory of secrets kept and truths revealed. The water that had hidden Marcus's rifle for 3 years now reflected a community that had learned hard lessons about the hidden wounds of war and the importance of reaching out to those who suffer in silence. In the end, the river had not just revealed the location of a weapon. It had revealed the need for healing, understanding, and redemption in a world where the visible wounds of war heal faster than the invisible ones. The truth that emerged from those muddy waters was more complex than anyone had expected, but it was truth nonetheless, and it had set a community and a troubled veteran on a path toward healing that continued long after the legal proceedings had ended. The story that began with a fisherman's discovery had become a testament to the power of persistence, the complexity of human nature, and the possibility that even the most broken lives could be rebuilt with proper support and genuine commitment to change. The river had kept its secret and then revealed it when the time was right, but the real revelation was about the capacity for redemption that exists in every human story, no matter how dark it might seem.